Uh, Welcome you all to the second part of my MOOC lecture on caste in literary bones, Ambedkar's Unfinished Revolution, which is a part of the Indian Writing in English and Translation course. So this here, as you can see, the first slide of my screen, there is this image of decimation and demolition. And the key text which we are reading here in the light of literary activism and Dalit literary discourse is the annihilation of caste. And the notion of annihilation we can think of twofold. One is the kind of annihilation which is always there in the language of the French philosopher Derrida, always and already. Something which is commonsensical, which is always out there, a form of invisibilization of the outcast, their ways of life, their negation from the political, social, philosophical, literary, and religious system, or their existence as negated subjects, as subjugated, oppressed subjects, who are not only oppressed, but they are also restricted in terms of the right to natural resource, the right to education, right to social justice, right to choose their life partners, right to choose their profession. This kind of invisibilization, negation, and restriction is something which could be discussed in the light of Dalit literature, which have been discussed nowadays very much. Caste is there in the literary bones. We have not identified them. The literary bones would also refer to the phenomenological material reality in which the outcast subject dwells. There has been this proliferation of Dalit discourses nowadays. But in order to read them, how much Ambedkar's annihilation of caste can be of help? This is our contention here. We will divide our lecture into certain chunks, certain aspects of casteism, of how the outcast is produced, which is closely connected to annihilation of caste as a text itself. But we also need to remember that the Dalit literary discourse is something which has been inaugurated by Ambedkar. How? Because Ambedkar's text, Annihilation of Caste, is not only a political philosophical exposition, but it also comes with examples of blatant casteism. Particularly, if you read the chapter 2, you will see there are a series of examples where Ambedkar shows how caste alienation operates in Gujarat or in Jaipur, in different parts of area. When we think of India as a land of unity, we can also think of the negative unity by which India, the Hindu India, has been united, and which we need to eradicate, counter, dispose of in order to achieve a higher national integration and goal. So, on one hand, there is this move towards integration. On the other hand, there is this move towards annihilation. But this annihilation is not one-sided. This annihilation is against the annihilation which has been performed by the upper caste dominated, Savarna dominated society for centuries, and which continues in new manifold forms in modernity as well. We will examine and do a phenomenological reading of caste, a phenomenological literary reading of the outcast narratives, Dalit narratives. Dalit is a key political term which has been used by Ambedkar along with the term untouchable. Who are the Dalits? If you read Dalit Panther Manifesto, if you go through the Dalit Panther movement of the 1970s and 80s, you will understand that Dalit literary discourse has been so much propelled by Ambedkar's ideas. which talks about outcast people as outside the fold. Outside the fold is the name of an essay by Ambedkar himself, which could be read parallel with Annihilation of Caste. So when we are reading the text of Annihilation of Caste, we also need to read the parallel texts such as Riddles in Hinduism, Outside the Fold, they say, or Castes in India, which predates Annihilation of Caste, or texts such as Untouchables, Who They Are and How They Became Untouchables, which is dated after Annihilation of Caste. So through this series of readings, we can understand Annihilation of Caste, its significance. And this series is not continued and ended with Ambedkar himself, what has several afterlives in the outcast narratives, in the memoirs, in the experience-based literary texts from India. So with these points, I would proceed with the beginning of Annihilation of Caste, how Ambedkar starts the discourse of Annihilation of Caste in this text, which is an undelivered speech, which was supposed to be delivered to annual conference of Jat Pat Torak Mandal, a wing of Arya Samaj, and it was supposed to be Ambedkar's presidential address, which was objected and which was cancelled. The event was cancelled. Not only Ambedkar's speech, but the event was cancelled, had to be cancelled, because Ambedkar could not fit in to the upper caste, Savarna-dominated group which organized this lecture. So they cancelled the speech after repeated request to Ambedkar to change some sections of the text, particularly those which talks about going outside the Hindu fold. Here you can see on screen that Ambedkar is starting with a note of dissent and tone of irony, which is tinged with irony, where he says that, why have you invited an ontology like me to this conference, where I am a misfit, I don't fit in. So this is a section, obviously, which was written before the cancellation of the speech, before the annihilation of the event. And here Ambedkar clearly writes, according to the Shastras, the Brahmin is appointed to be the Guru for the three Varnas, is the direction of the Shastras. So a Guru cannot be an outcast. The Mandal therefore knows from whom a Hindu should take his lessons and from whom he should not. The Shastras do not permit a Hindu to accept anyone as his Guru merely because he is well versed. So knowledge does not confirm the participation, the inclusion of a person to instruct, to deliver a speech. And here Ambedkar from the beginning creates this kind of difference, divergence between us and them, between me and you, which is very clear when we read the anti-caste narratives. Particularly the Dalit memoirs, the Dalit texts, they repeatedly counters the broad canon, the broad discourse, the Hindu-dominated discourse of dharma. Here you can see that Ambedkar talks about profession. We have already discussed, and there has been a lot of talk about this definition of the caste system as graded inequality, as enclosed class. And here we see that certain kind of professions are designated for the outcast. The professions with which a certain kind of ignominy, a certain kind of shame is associated. And this is very important, this is very significant, like this professional aspect of caste, is because those professions, and you know that that kind of caste system is, and also the Varna system, initially the Varna system was based on the idea of gunas, of the properties, and these properties are assumed to be transcendental and predecided in terms of the birth. In terms of birth, in terms of the the karmafal, the effects of your action in a particular birth, your role, your guna in the next birth will be decided. So one cannot just choose to go outside the caste, to go outside the professional realm to which is decided for him or her. And we see that according to this Shastric injunction, certain kind of tasks which are associated with picking waste, disposing dead bodies, cleaning garbage is always associated with, and this is associated with the Dalit subject. And this is also mentioned in Dharma Shastras such as Manu Samhita, which designates this ignominious work task for the Dalits, and at the same time it also explains the Dalits as wasted subjects, as unclean, polluted subjects. So the polluted things and polluted beings are associated together. The Dalits are supposed to deal with the polluted things. And this idea of polluted things you will see very much associated with Dalit identity. They live in polluted areas, abandoned areas, wasted lands. They deal with the garbage, the waste, and they also are identified as similar to garbage, unclean, who as untouchables. If you read Ambedkar's essay Outside the Fold, you will understand that how this casteism is mediated in the village society. It has various afterlives, of course, but in a village society, casteism operates by keeping the outcast outside the village. They are outside the fold. And here I would talk about the two aspects of being an outcast. One is the symbolic aspect, the other is the literal aspect. They are literally kept outside the mainstream polity, mainstream society, the sanitized spaces, the privileged spaces. In various autobiographies, we see this kind of Bama's Kurukku. We see the Dalit Christians, they live in spaces where major schools, hospitals, educational institutions are not located. They are far off. In other Dalit autobiographies also, we see that the Dalit habitations are located far away from mainstream society. So, and mainly in abandoned lands, in lands which is full of garbage or close to the garbage. So, this thing we need to keep in mind. So, this is a form of, spatial segregation, which we also see mentioned in Ambedkar's Annihilation of Caste. This is a process of abandonment, and this process of abandonment, I use this word abandonment from Giorgio Agamben, a philosopher, who talks about that how human society distinguishes between qualified life and unqualified life. But here, in case of caste system, the unqualified lives are transcendental, hereditary, and perpetual. So the Dalit life is not important, unimportant. In a text like Surviving in My World by Manohar Mauli Bishwas, who is a Bengali Dalit writer, in this autobiography, he shows that how his life is like a water hyacinth. A water hyacinth is a weed. So the life of a Dalit is like a weed, unimportant, segregated, and wasted, and wasteful as well. Now, coming back to the text of Annihilation of Caste, how this text delineates the concept of alienation, and how this alienation is, as I said, both literal and also symbolic. How it is symbolic? Symbolically, the Dalit subject is always an outcast, someone who should be kept outside the mainstream sphere of life. In every sphere of life, we don't give them space. Like when you use the word giving someone space, the word space is not only literal but also symbolic. That is why Ambedkar was surprised and taken aback when he was asked to give the presidential address. And we can see that eventually, when Ambedkar asserted his Dalit identity over the quote-unquote Hindu identity, and Ambedkar always thought that adopting the Hindu identity and the Hindu way of bringing the outcast people into its fold by questioning untouchability, but at the same time not questioning the Shastric injunctions of the caste system, and more broadly the Varna system, there is the possibility of what we would call Sanskritization, of appropriation of the Dalits within the Hindu fold. The inequality will perpetuate, but by appropriation and adaptation of the Dalits within the Hindu fold, we can see that there is no possibility of emancipation. The Dalits will always be segregated as an inferior subject unless and until we question the caste order and we question the division of labor which has been artificially created and maintained in terms of not only profession, but also spatial segregation. Ambedkar's annihilation of caste talks about annihilation in these two senses. One, and the annihilation which is invisible, and the other annihilation is the annihilation of that annihilation, which Ishita Roy very much discussed in his article. From that point, we can think of Ambedkar's text, this particular text, not the other text which he wrote as a kind of memoir, waiting for a visa, but this particular text, Annihilation of Caste, as an example of testimony. It is a philosophical, political treatise, it is an essay, but it is also testimonial in its separation of the we from the you. So the we and you, the Savarna dominated, and it is also to be noted that the Jatpat Taruk Mandal, the most of the members of this organization almost all of the members are from Savarna caste. So it is very easier for Ambedkar literally, not only symbolically, to identify them as they, as you, who are, and separate himself as us, as me. And here we can think of testimony, Dalit memoirs as testimonies, and as Derrida discussed testimony, there are two aspects of testimony. And we should talk about this tension between the two senses of testimony here. One is when we think of the legal meaning of the word testimony as a kind of third-person account, a document which would testify, which would prove something, that something has happened, something has taken place, or something is true, which is supposed to be objective and impersonal. On the other hand, we have the idea of testimony as a tale which could be told by the person who is experienced. So there is this split between the idea of testimony as kind of which comes from experience, where the person, like the Holocaust testimonies, where the person who lives to tell the tale are only people who can testify what has happened to them. Just like the black testimonies, just like the Holocaust testimonies, the Dalit testimonies maybe are the only account which shows actually what happens to Dalits in their everyday lives. This everyday life of the Dalit subject is explicable in Dalit testimonies very much. And this tension, but we have to think that this third-person narrative is the only account, only possible exposition which we find in case of Dalit subjects. That is why it becomes testimony also in the legal sense. That Dalit literary texts, not only the testimonies, the memoirs, but also the fiction, the poetry, are often propelled by their personal experience of alienation and abandonment, of being reduced to the status of what Agamben would call Zoe, the unqualified life, the life which could be killed, abandoned, which is unimportant, as opposed to the bios, which talks about the qualified life, the proper life, which should be preserved, which should be taken care of by the state. There should be a hiatus, a difference, a struggle, a strife in the Dalit literary discourse between the way Gandhi and other upper caste Savarna leaders, Savarna thinkers would talk about the oppression which is mediated to the Dalits, and the way the Dalits themselves talk about their own crisis. Because the Dalit discourse is something which is akin to what we can call embedded history. It talks about the deep history which could not be seen on the surface. It could be exposed as a certain kind of what Foucault would call subjugated knowledges, which were suppressed, which could not be seen on the face, which has been invisibilized. So when we talk about oppression as an archival reality, which is there in the historical discourse, or as a sociological reality, we fail to realize what is happening to the Dalit subject actually. Because that kind of experience of alienation in every sphere of life could not be understood by the upper caste society. They would talk about their anti-caste moves as a kind of reform, which is taken from outside. But Ambedkar taking an insider's view, just as the Dalit writers. And here, when we read a story like Premchand's Kafan, there is this Dalit discourse against this story, where we can see that the chamar men engaged in merrymaking while the woman in the family, someone's wife, is dying. So this heedlessness, this kind of uncaring attitude, which is portrayed as a kind of moral degradation among the Dalits, has been questioned by the Dalit subjects, because it only portrays one aspect more evidently, more conspicuously, that is the aspect of the Dalit moral degradation out of the effect of the social structure. So this social structure is mentioned but not elaborated with such details as the detailing of the moral degradation of these people. So Premchand's novel Rangabhumi was burned by the Dalits. So this kind of oppositional politics is very much there in Ambedkar. Ambedkar's Annihilation of Caste is not only an anti-caste text, but it is an insurrectionary text, and it questions the upper caste way of inducing a problem-solving model for the outcast people. And we would like to discuss the Dalit literary discourse and its connection with Ambedkar's thinking along three lines. We can discuss it along three lines. One is in terms of space, which I already mentioned to some extent. And in another text by Ambedkar, Untouchables, who they are and how they became untouchables, Ambedkar talks about a myth, a kind of mythified anthropological discourse. I would say call it mythical because there is no practical evidence always. He talks about how there were different tribes once upon a time fighting with one another, which believed in endogamy, which believed in inbreeding, and then some of the tribes were defeated. The tribes who were defeated were kept outside the village on condition that they will serve the people inside the village. The broken men, the people who survived from this conflict and who were defeated, subjugated, they became the outcast. That was Ambedkar's tale, anthropological tale of how the untouchables became untouchables. Because they were from people from a broken tribe, the broken men who were kept outside the village, who had to serve the upper caste and do all the kinds of unclean tasks, and at the same time they had restricted limited resource. They had restricted limited entry to the polity, to the mainstream polity. So this kind of segregation we can see is very much evident from the Dalit life narratives in various possible ways. And then we have the discourse of how caste and gender are related, they are connected. And it is very much evident from reading the Dalit life narratives, where we see and the Dalit women's lives are constituted and controlled and governed on one hand by the patriarchy inside their community, but also by the upper caste Brahminical patriarchy. Brahminical patriarchy is based on the rule of endogamy, that people of who are outcast, they cannot come into the village, but they are supposed to remain outside the possibility of getting married to the upper caste. And this kind of caste endogamy was maintained, and it was also maintained to maintain untouchability, so that the castes don't mix up with one another. And you know that the mixing of caste is the reason Ambedkar had this phrase, the madness of Manu, which is there in his book Riddles in Hinduism. In one of the riddles, in the riddle 17, he talks about the madness of Manu, where he discusses the various subcastes, particularly the outcasts, as an effect of what we call protilom marriage. That is the marriage which is against the caste order, where a person from a boy from a marginalized caste dares to marry a woman from the upper caste. So this kind of, and he explains, but Ambedkar says that it is not possible to explain this kind of outcastism on the basis of endogamy and on the basis of the mixing of caste, because endogamy and the mixing of caste cannot happen hand in hand. And the women, the excessive control on the Hindu woman is actually because of this Brahminical patriarchy, which tries to maintain this segregation between the castes along the bloodlines. And the third point is the religious exposition of caste and how religion itself can become a space for intervention to counter the religious Hindu religious injunctions. So religion is not one-sided. The religious discourse is split from inside, where on one hand certain religious injunctions are imposed. On the other hand, there can be some marginalized religious practices from within which questions the dominant Hindu religious practices. And they would create alternative myths, alternative stories in order to counter the mainstream Hinduism. With these 3 points, I would refer to I would give you some literary examples. Like this particular text from Surviving in My World, I already mentioned this text by Manohar Mouli Biswas, a Bengali Dalit writer, which has been translated in English, we can see. And that is the significance of translation, where we can see that Dalits from one part of India with different culture, but similarity of caste system communicates and continues in another part of India. With some kind of difference. That there are differences in the forms and expositions of casteism, but certain patterns of alienation and abandonment for the untouchables, for the outcast, for the marginalized caste is maintained very much. So Surviving in the World, we can see the word world is very significant, because this world, my world, and is different from your world. That is what Manohar Mouli Biswas wants to say. This is a world which is dominated by poverty, by casteism, by environmental separation, segregation, and limited right to resource. So it is a life which is akin to a weed, like a white water hyacinth. Similar kind of spatial abandonment, which is more glaring in case of Amprakash Valmiki's Jutan, who is a Hindi Dalit writer. In this Hindi Dalit text, we see that the Churha community, they live outside the mainstream polity, and they live in a part of the village which is very close to the garbage dump, close to the place where people throw their excreta. So the identity of the Dalit as unclean and close to the excreta is maintained. Very important scholar Joel Lee, in his essay Odor and Order, talks about the association of the foul odor with the Brahminical patriarchal order of the caste system. So in Jutan we see that very much there, and Joel Lee makes a reading of Jutan and some parts of Uttar Pradesh where he conducts his field work. And this is a book which talks about the afterlife of spatial alienation in caste, in the uprooted life, where we see that Jatin Bala, another Bengali Dalit writer who has also been translated into English, his shift from the East Pakistan or Bangladesh, he becomes a Dalit refugee, and we see how Dalit refugees were treated differentially, how they were pushed into the refugee camps, how unlike the upper caste refugees who were given colonies and they were given lands to stay. Finally, we see how Dalit patriarchy operates. In this book, Gendering Caste, we see that how caste and gender are associated and how women are controlled in order to maintain the caste order. And in texts such as the autobiography of Baby Kamle, The Prison We Broke, we clearly see how the lower caste people, the outcast people, the marginalized people, they adopt the means of the upper caste to control their women. Because the value system of controlling women is actually floated into the lower caste from the upper caste ideology. So the Brahminical patriarchy affects the Dalit as well. And finally, I would refer to one story, and with this I will end my discussion. On Farm Ground, this is also a story by Jatin Bala, which has been translated. And with respect to this particular slide, which talks about the myth of the Hari community, Balaram Hari, a person who actually mimicked the Brahmins, making their offerings to their forefathers inside knee-deep water. And he was telling that I am giving water. He was observing similar ritual, and he was telling that I am giving water to the fields. And this story actually uses this myth and shows how, and creates a character who is similar to Balaram Hari. Hari is a minor religious sect, and we see that in minor religious sects, this kind of contra politics to the upper caste dominated discourse is very much in place. So the religious and the literary, as Shekhar Bandyopadhyay and Anusua Basu Choudhury in their recent book Caste and Partition would show, that religion and literature becomes the cauldron of challenging the caste discourse from various parts of India, but also in Bengal. So with this, I end my lecture. Thank you.